Republican Congressman Will Hurd of Texas, and he joins us now. Congressman, great to have you with us. You speak from experience. You are in a border district. This is not a theoretical or hypothetical argument to you. You know what's happening at the border. What do you make of the president's address last night, and more broadly, his digging in on the request for $5.7 billion for a physical structure along the southern border?
Well, first and foremost, if this is indeed a crisis, the people that are dealing with the crisis should get paid. I was just down on the border this weekend. I talked with a number of men and women from Border Patrol. They used some very colorful language that I can't repeat on television about how they felt about, working without pay and the shutdown, flying through the airports. My hometown of San Antonio, the TSA agents are nervous, and we all know that almost 1 million federal employees are going to be, their paychecks going to be impacted this next paycheck on January 11th. Now, the reality is, since 2000 till 2017, that's the latest credible numbers, we've seen an 80% decrease in apprehensions at the border. As you said in the lead up to this, most of the illegal drugs that are coming into our country are coming through our ports of entry. To give you a crazy stat, our Coast Guard can only action 25% of the known intelligence on drugs coming into our country. That's an absolutely crazy statistic, and this is something where we should be doubling down on making sure Coast Guard has cutters. We could get to a big number like $5 billion when you improve the technology that's out our ports of entry, do what I call the smart wall, where you're using technology along all 2,000 miles of our border. It is 2019. We don't have operational control of our border, but the way you do that is with 21st century technology, not a 4th century solution.
All right, Congressman, so you've made a good case there, backed up by data, backed up by facts, but the president wants his wall. He wants $5.7 billion. We've seen Republicans in the Senate, some of your colleagues in the House, start to peel away from him, saying this is ridiculous, making the same case you make, that these people are not getting paid because the president won't move on his wall. So how do we as a country work our way out of this? How do we get those people paid?
So I think the solution is actually quite simple. There's a lot of pieces of legislation that's already out there. If you want to have some physical barriers, you can complete the Secure Fence Act. That's a handful of miles. You can replace some of the existing fencing. You have 650 miles of fencing that was created through the Secure Fence Act, and we all know how everybody voted for that back in the day in its amended version 2 years later. But we got to address some of the root causes. So shutting down the State Department is a bad idea because State Department and USAID is working on the root causes, and that is addressing violence and lack of economic opportunities in the Northern Triangle. That's El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. We can also streamline immigration, right? This is something, Joe, I know you from Florida, there's a lot of ag workers, and you can streamline that process so that we have the people we need in order to make our economy continue to grow. At 3.9% unemployment, that means every industry, whether it is agriculture or artificial intelligence, need workers. So streamline that. This is something that Pete Aguilar and I have been working on. Pete Aguilar is a Democrat from California on immigration. You can fix DACA, that's 1.2 million kids, and then you can work on the equivalent of a Marshall Plan in the Northern Triangle to address those issues. You put all those packages together, you can get north of the $5.6 billion. This is something that all Republicans and Democrats can agree to. And I think it was you, Joe, you were right before we went to commercial break, that the only way you get big things done here in Washington, D.C. is to actually work across the aisle. This is why the American people sent us up here, is to get things done, not burn this place down.
Yeah, we're going to Mike in 1 second, but I just wanted to, let's follow up on what you just said there. Isn't there a deal to be done between Republicans and Democrats where you talk about the heroin that's coming across the southern border and say, instead of building this wall, just throwing it out there, focus more on the ports of entry where 90% of the drugs come in. Instead of erecting steel slats, as you said, a 4th century solution, build these smart walls. I mean, our military is developing smart walls on battlefields to actually confuse our enemies. So if they're coming at you, the smart walls go up, and they confuse and disorient some of the toughest fighters in the world. It certainly could work at the border, couldn't it?
It is, and they're already testing that technology. They're testing some of this technology in my district. They call it the Innovative Tower Initiative, and where you're able to track someone that comes across the border, you're able to follow them, and you're able to deploy a drone or a border patrol to do that interdiction. All that data that's being used is beamed into a smartphone that's on someone's arm. But guess what? Our men and women in Border Patrol that's doing a tough job, their smartphones or their phones don't always work in all these different areas that you're doing. Wow. There's a thing called cane in the Rio Grande. It's an infectious weed, invasive weed, excuse me, that's not from that area, that grows. It looks like a bamboo patch. If you got rid of that, one, it improves the flow of the Rio Grande and it helps agriculture, but it gets rid of a barrier that some of the people that are trying to sneak across are doing. People have to remember, I have 820 miles of border. That's about 2/3 of the Texas-Mexico border, a little bit less than a half of the border between the United States and Mexico. In some parts of the border, Border Patrol's response time is measured in hours to days. If your response time is measured in hours to day, a wall is not a physical barrier. And so we got to be having these smart solutions. And the point on drugs, roughly, and this is a very conservative estimate, $66 billion of illegal drugs are being sold in the United States of America. Right? And most of that is coming through our ports of entry. And I think Senator Kaine mentioned this earlier. And a lot of this is coming through our post offices. So they need to have the tools in order to address those things as well.
So Congressman, given what you just said, what you've been saying since you've been on this morning, last night the president appealed to the fear factor, which will work, I assume, among a certain percentage of people. But explain the more efficient uses of intelligence gathering, given your background in intelligence gathering, and the need for more police presence, for lack of a better phrase, more feet on the ground along this border rather than a wall.
Absolutely. Right now, Border Patrol has 2,000 positions that they can't fill. And one of the reasons they can't fill is because of they have retention issues. So, for example, if a Border Patrol agent is transferred from New Mexico to Texas, in about 40% of those moves, they have to pay for their own move. That's absolutely crazy. What business does that? There's nobody else in the federal government that does that kind of thing. And that's why you're seeing one example of why you're seeing a difficulty of having more folks. We need to work closer with our friends in Mexico. People forget that Mexico actually returns more Central Americans to their home than the United States does. And so we need to be working with this new administration on those issues and drive our operations through intelligence. And I go back to that Coast Guard example. If they can only action 25% of the known drugs, that means 75% of the drugs are coming through our ports of entry. We don't even know what that number is when it comes to our land borders. So I'm a professional intelligence officer. I spent 9.5 years as an undercover officer in the CIA. The people that are making the drugs and deporting and moving the drugs in Mexico and Central America, these folks aren't hiding in caves. We need to make sure that we're using all the tools in our toolkit to go after this threat, and the kingpin human smugglers as well. So one of the things when you talk about the drug cartels are making $66 billion, the U.S. intelligence budget, $61 billion. Who do you think's winning that fight? And so every time we make a move, the narcos and the narco traficantes are going to do a counter move. And so this is a battle. We need to be using the latest technology, and we should be talking about these solutions. But one of the problems that we have here in Washington, D.C. is that the negotiators on both sides of the aisle lack trust amongst each other. They lack a granular understanding of the nuance and the details of border security, of immigration, and that's getting in the way of us coming to a deal, reopening our government, and making sure the hardworking men and women throughout the federal government are getting paid and have their